Kathleen Rockwell, came to Alaska in 1900. And Klondike Kate spent her more formidable years in Dawson City as a vaudeville singer and dancer. Now, I wasn't just kidding earlier today. She wasn't just a performer. She was actually a phenomenon. Earlier I mentioned, her famous flame dance. Now, she'd sweep onto the stage with a sparkling dress, and then all of a sudden she'd drop 200 feet of red ribbon on both sides of her hands. Now, again, I don't have these props, but if you could imagine it, she would swirl and twirl this ribbon in such a way that eventually she would appear as if she was a tower of fire. Now, again, that doesn't sound that crazy today, but back then it would have miners who were half starved, half frozen, completely dazzled. They would throw not only their paper bills or their silver dollars, but actually raw chunks of gold onto the stage. Now, it wasn't all fun and games and sunshine and rainbows for Kate, though. Eventually, she would live with some drama. After her singing days, she would meet a man that she would actually bankroll, and then that gentleman would eventually leave her for another woman. Man, am I right, ladies? The worst. But her legend still lives on. In fact, when she was older, Hollywood came knocking at her door. They actually wanted to find out how to write stories from the perspective of a woman who had actually sang and danced her way into Alaskan Gold Rush legend. Good job, Kathleen. So there you have it, though. These are our ladies, and they weren't just entertainers. They were actually, a lot of them were architects of their own destinies. They thrived in a place that ate men alive. And although the men were mining the gold, the ladies mined the miners, and sometimes actually came away even richer. Now, though it is at this point, though, I would like to pause. Because although, yes, the women I have just mentioned, they did exist, and many of which had been very successful. But it needs to be said that this was not the fate for a lot of women during the Alaskan Gold Rush. Sadly, many of them woke up to a very harsh reality in Alaska, and many of them were actually forced to turn to the oldest profession just as a means to get by. And a lot of them practiced it just to make enough to travel back down south. So while there were a few that managed to make the best of a bad decision, we do recognize this harsh truth and the history in which the Gold Rush stands upon. All right, on that happy note, are we ready to meet the men? Okay, Kate, we gave the ladies a lot more than that. Gentlemen, can we get a little more claps? All right, let's meet the men. All right, so that brings us to our first man, George Carmack. It makes sense that he makes our list because, he was the man who was officially credited with the discovery claim at Rabbit Creek in 1896. Now, on face value, that probably means absolutely nothing to anybody. But it was what ignited the entire Klondike Gold Rush. Now, his name is on the paperwork, and his face shows up in the history books. And for more than a century, he's actually been celebrated as a brilliant discoverer. Here's the thing. He didn't make that discovery just on his own. By his side was always his wife, Kate Carmack, her brothers, Skookum Jim, and their cousin, Dawson Charlie. All Tagish individuals and all from a local indigenous village. Now, none of us, of course, were there that day that the gold was found. But what we do know is this. Without Kate and her family, he would have never been in that area. Nor would he have ever survived the harsh Yukon winters. And finally, he would have never had the claim that actually reshaped the North. Because sadly, the Gold Rush, like much history, it's filled with these gaps. Places where indigenous contributions were essentially unacknowledged. Some accounts even suggest that it was Kate that day that actually found the gold. Yet, the official records still have George's name on it. Next on our list, we have Frank Canton. He was another first in Alaska's last frontier. Frank, he was actually in Alaska for a very different reason than George. Frank Canton was actually Alaska's first law officer of the Alaskan Interior, most notably known for his efforts over in Nome. But let's not polish that fancy badge too shiny just yet. In fact, Frank, he knew crime. Maybe a little too well. As a matter of fact, he was known for practicing it down in the lower 48 before taking the job. And in some accounts actually say that he only took the job in Alaska because he was actually running away from the law in Oklahoma. Anyway, For Frank, law enforcement was, let's just call it, flexible. And in Nome, well, he worked actually both sides of the law. On one side, he was the man tasked with keeping order in a town that had more gamblers than gold pans. On the other, well, he actually held a second cushy job with the North American Transportation and Trading Company, one of the very corporations that was looking to take advantage of honest miners' claims. So, as you can see, back then, there were not all those papers that you fill out when you take a new job with a conflict of interest. Well, they didn't exist back then, and clearly Frank, well, he took full advantage of that at the time. And this brings us to possibly one of the most notorious characters of the Alaskan Gold Rush, Jefferson Randolph Smith, aka Soapy Smith. Now, I could go on and on and on about Soapy. In fact, this entire presentation could probably be about Soapy Smith. So I'm just going to provide some of the highlights for you folks. So Soapy's first claim to fame was a little-known scam called the Soap Bar Scam. Get it? Soapy Smith? Anyway, basically what he would do is he would take some soap bars and he'd wrap them in brown paper. And in a few of those soap bars, he would stuff in a couple dollar bills. And then he'd sell the entire lot for $1 a piece, basically giving everyone the impression that they could either win their money back or actually leave with a profit. Here's the thing. The only people that ever actually got the money in their bars of soap were already on Soapy's payroll. Before anybody noticed, well, Soapy would skip town and start the whole thing all over again. But when he got to Skagway in the 1890s, well, he actually upgraded his game. He built an entire criminal empire in this tiny little southeast Alaskan town. Soapy ran gambling halls where the games were rigged. He operated fake telegraph offices where the wires barely reached the trees out back. And he actually offered protective services, where it was his own men who were causing the trouble that you were paying to fix. That's right. For a while, he owned the town council, the police, the elections. And Skagway was less a boom town than actually Soapy's kingdom. That's right. Not only was he the kingpin of the underworld in Skagway, he actually painted himself as the town benefactor, shaking hands and kissing babies at his very own 4th of July parade. That is, of course, until he met his end in 1898 in a gunfight down by the docks of Skagway. To me, it sounds like a pretty, fitting curtain call for Alaska's greatest con man, don't you think? Okay, and the next person really needs no introduction. We have Wyatt Earp. We know him from the OK Corral all the way to Dodge City. That story has been immortalized in a number of movies. Anyone want to throw out a name of one of those movies I'm talking about? Tombstone's a very popular one. Exactly. Well, unfortunately, though, Wyatt Earp, he didn't ride off into the Arizona sunset like that movie would have you believe. No, instead, he decided to head north. Not for justice, but actually for profit. And when he eventually made it to Nome, Alaska, well, he wasn't looking for another shootout. He was actually there on business. And he opened up the Dexter Saloon, which was Nome's very first 2-story wooden structure. And it quickly became actually the fanciest bar in town. If you picture this, you got muddy miners pushing their way through the swinging doors of the Dexter, all of a sudden to be surrounded by polished wood, bright lights, and of course Wyatt Earp himself behind the bar. Quite the sight you can imagine. Fortunately, though, it was short-lived. Wyatt Earp was not in Alaska for a long time. He was there for a lucrative time. When he left Alaska in 1901, just 1 year later, well, he left with $80,000 in his pocket. Today, that equates to roughly around $2 million. Not a bad haul, if you ask me. So, was Wyatt a hero in Alaska? I mean, not really. He wasn't cleaning up the streets or chasing down bandits. He was actually cashing in. And I mean, really, who could blame him? I mean, being the smart man that he was, well, he found out pretty early on that it was a heck of a lot easier to make money selling beer to miners than mining for gold yourself. Okay, next we have a man that, never really enforced the law, but actually wrote laws from behind his desk. And Alexander Mackenzie, he's not your typical gold rush adventurer. He didn't pack a bag overtop the Chilkoot Trail. He never panned for gold in a frozen creek. No, in fact, he's actually a North Dakota politician. And he positioned himself during the gold rush as a type of power broker. You know, he controlled the courts, the contracts, and all the cronies that actually came with it. And he used his influence to reach as far north as Nome, Alaska. And he helped appoint federal court positions in Alaska that gave him leverage to essentially take over the gold fields from thousands of miles away. He engineered rulings that stripped honest miners of their claims and gave them to himself or his business partners. Now, this wasn't just shady dealings, folks. This was outright theft. Now, miners would protest, and newspapers would actually call it corruption on a grand scale. And for a moment, in 1901, well, it looked like, all this was going to catch up with old Alexander. Here's the thing. Do politicians ever really get what's coming to them? I mean, after being arrested, tried, and convicted of contempt of court, well, President McKinley would pardon him in that very same year. So much for frontier justice. Okay, and we close out our characters here with one of the most craziest stories from the Alaskan Gold Rush, Albert Johnson. Now, Albert Johnson's true identity was actually never discovered. But what a lot of people would call him was the Mad Trapper of Rat River. Now, this is a clever name, however, there's absolutely no evidence that he actually ever trapped along Rat River. What there is evidence of, though, is that in the 1930s, well, he became the subject of the Yukon's largest manhunt in history. As the story goes, well, the Mounties, they came over to his house and knocked on the door to ask him some questions about some traps being tampered with in the area. Well, Albert, he didn't want to answer those questions. So he basically just opened fire on the authorities. Of course, afterwards, he escaped. And after escaping, Albert managed to evade the Mounties across the frozen north for weeks and months, surviving both blizzards and additional gunfights, before finally meeting his end in 1932, 2 years after that moment they came knocking on the door. Now, you might be asking, what does this have to do with the gold rush? Because, being honest, the story doesn't exactly spell it out. But the thing is, nobody actually knew his true identity, what he was doing in the Yukon, and what he actually was doing to sustain himself all that way up north. So there is speculation that Albert here may have actually been on the run from the law in one of U.S.'s boom towns. Someone who had done something very wrong during the early days of the Alaskan Gold Rush. So, as you can see, the gold rush wasn't always just about making a fortune. A lot of times it was actually about power and control. Every saloon, every brothel, every mine was a battleground. And violence wasn't the exception. In fact, it was the rule. As we've learned today, well, Alaska, it wasn't tamed. It was wrestled into submission. And the scars from that battle, well, they still exist in the form of stories. So folks, that brings us to the end of our characters, but I'm an educator, and I like to think of myself as such, so I really want to do a fun little game here. And I want to do a knowledge test and see who is paying attention to our characters here on stage. But in order to do so, I'm going to go ahead and need a volunteer from the audience. Would anyone like to venture and determine whether they feel like they know our characters best? Anybody? Silence from the crowd? I see somebody being pointed out over here. No? Okay, all right. So if we're not going to volunteer, I'm going to go ahead and ask, now, is anybody in the room celebrating something? Let's say a wedding, a divorce, maybe? Birthday? We got a birthday over here? All right, sir, I apologize, but your wife has just volunteered you to participate. Now, unfortunately, you can't come on stage because of ADA regulations, but I'm going to come on over to you. Now, I promise, sir, don't worry, it'll be worth it. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to tell you 3 different stories, okay? When you hear the stories, you're going to determine whether the character is a hero or a villain. And then you're going to go ahead and venture a guess as to who you think it was. I promise we went over every character that's part of this game. Get all three right, there's going to be a prize waiting for you on the other side. Now, what was your name, sir? Bill. Can everyone give Bill a big round of applause? Thank you, Bill. And, sir, what was the wife's name? Martha. Can everyone give Martha a big round of applause for